At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé pulled out a chair as I was sitting down, and I fell to ground. The sound of my body hitting the polished floor echoed through the reception hall, louder in my ears than the music that had been playing a second before. Gasps rose from a few corners, but they were quickly swallowed by a wave of awkward laughter. For a moment, I just lay there, the coldness of the tiles seeping into my palms, the sting of pain shooting up my hip. My pride hurt far more than my body. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. This wasn't a trip or a stumble. He had timed it, his hand pulling the chair back just as my knees bent, his smirk betraying his intention before I even landed. I pushed myself up slowly, my joints protesting, while the weight of eyes pressed down on me harder than the fall itself. Some guests stared, some looked away in discomfort, and a few chuckled behind their hands as if it was all some harmless prank. My daughter stood a few feet away in her white dress, her hands clasped nervously around her bouquet. She didn't rush to help me. She didn't demand an apology. Instead, she glanced at her new husband with a tight smile, as though to say, "Please, let's not ruin this day." That smile cut deeper than any laughter could. My hands shook as I steadied myself on the edge of the table. I forced myself upright, forcing my back straight, even though the humiliation burned through me. I searched the room, hoping for someone to speak up, to call it what it was, but no one did. The music hesitated and then started again, as if nothing had happened. People went back to sipping champagne, whispering to each other, pretending it was all just part of the evening. I could still hear the faint sound of his laugh, careless and cruel, ringing in my ears. I lowered myself into the chair again, this time testing its weight before sitting fully, my movement slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, not from the fall, but from the realization settling over me. This wasn't just a childish prank. It was a message, a way of showing me my place. My daughter's new husband wanted to remind everyone that I was the old man, the relic, the butt of a joke, and my daughter had let him. As the toasts began, the hall filled with words of love, of hope for their future, but all I heard was the hollow ringing of my own silence. My jaw clenched as I kept my eyes forward, my thoughts spiraling inward. I had given everything for this girl, my money, my time, my strength. And in return, at the most important moment of her life, she allowed me to be humiliated like I was nothing. I felt something inside me shift that night, something that would never return to how it once was. This was more than a fall. It was the moment I understood that respect, once lost, cannot be regained through silence. The pain in my hip and back throbbed as I lowered myself back into the chair, but it was nothing compared to the searing ache in my chest when I looked at my daughter. She stood there in her gown, the picture of beauty and grace, but instead of rushing to my side or demanding an apology from her husband, she let out a small, nervous laugh. It wasn't the laughter of a child trying to lighten the mood. It was the laughter of someone too afraid of embarrassment, too eager to protect the image of her new marriage rather than the dignity of her own father. That sound cut deeper than the fall, because it told me where her loyalty lay. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the glances darted between relatives and friends. Some of them shook their heads, disapproval flickering in their eyes, but none of them spoke. Others smirked, clearly entertained by what had just happened, as though it was some clever joke to start the evening. I saw a group of younger men snickering near the back, whispering to each other, and every hushed word felt like another blow to my pride. The rest simply turned back to their plates, pretending nothing had happened, pretending it was just an accident, pretending I was not sitting there, humiliated, in front of them all. The sting of betrayal deepened with every second that passed, and I realized that no one would defend me. No one would tell the groom he had gone too far. My daughter's silence spoke louder than anything else. Her refusal to acknowledge what had been done, confirming what I had long suspected but never wanted to believe. I felt like a stranger in a room full of people who owed their comfort, their celebration, even their very gathering to the sacrifices I had made. My hands clenched under the table as I tried to steady my breathing, keeping my face calm even as my chest burned with shame. The pain in my body would fade with time, but the memory of my daughter's laughter and the mocking eyes of those guests would never leave me. It was in that moment that the wedding stopped being a day of joy for me and became the day I saw the truth laid bare. I was not respected. I was not valued. I was nothing more than an old man to be mocked, tolerated, and used until I had nothing left to give. And while they thought I would simply sit there and swallow the insult, they had no idea what they had awoken inside me. As I sat there forcing myself to keep a calm expression while the celebration carried on as though nothing had happened, my thoughts spiraled back through the decades, and every memory of sacrifice began to press against me like the weight of stones. I remembered the nights when I worked until dawn just to keep food on the table, the extra shifts I took so she could have the dress she wanted for school dances, the times I went without so she could have more. I remembered patching up her first car with my own hands because she couldn't afford the repairs, standing in the cold garage with aching fingers while she slept peacefully inside. I remembered the tuition checks, the rent I covered when she was starting out, and the countless bills I paid when she promised me it was only temporary. All of it, every drop of sweat and every sacrifice, I carried like a badge of honor because I believed it was worth it. I believed that one day she would look at me and understand what I had given for her life to be what it was. Yet here I was, sitting in the middle of her wedding reception, surrounded by people who didn't know or didn't care, treated like a relic whose worth had long expired. My daughter's nervous laugh when I fell, her unwillingness to defend me, was confirmation of what had been gnawing at me for years. I was not respected, not cherished, not valued. To them, I was the man who provided, who endured, who carried the burdens so they could walk freely. But I was never seen as more than that. Now, in the most public and humiliating way possible, I was shown my true place, not as a father to be honored, but as an old man to be mocked, a source of amusement. My heart tightened as I faced the reality I had tried so hard to ignore, that the family I had built with my hands and my sacrifices no longer saw me as a pillar, but as an obstacle, a reminder of what they wanted to leave behind. The hall glowed with warm lights, the music swelled with happiness, but to me it all rang hollow. I sat in the middle of it, hollowed out, stripped of the image I once carried of a family united by love and respect. That illusion shattered before me, and though no one noticed the pieces, I felt every shard piercing deeper into me. They thought I was too weak to see it, too tired to fight, too desperate to hold on to their affection. They were wrong. As I sat there trying to swallow the humiliation that still burned in my chest, memories began to surface one after another, and each one painted the same picture I had been too blind to admit until now. I remembered the first time my daughter brought him home, this man she now called her husband, with his polished shoes, slick-back hair, and a voice filled with rehearsed confidence. He shook my hand, glanced around my modest home, and smirked at the old wooden furniture I had built myself. "Charming," he said, with a tone that dripped with condescension, as if the labor of my hands was something beneath him. My daughter laughed back then, too, brushing off his words and adding, "Dad just doesn't get rid of anything. He's old-fashioned like that." I thought little of it at the time, convincing myself it was harmless teasing, but it was the first sign of how they truly saw me. Over the months and years that followed, the words never stopped. Old-fashioned, out of touch, too stubborn to understand how the world works now. I remember being mocked for wearing the same worn jacket year after year, the same jacket that had kept me warm through long nights of work, so that she could have new coats every winter. They joked about how I still wrote checks instead of transferring money on apps, even though it was those checks that paid for their rent and their groceries when they were struggling. I remember the nights my phone rang, always at inconvenient hours, always with the same desperate tone in her voice. "Dad, we need some help just this once." Just this once became again and again, and I gave every time, telling myself it was my duty, telling myself she would be grateful, but gratitude was scarce. The thanks I received were rushed, obligatory empty words that vanished the moment the money cleared. When I suggested being careful with spending or warned them not to take on debts they couldn't handle, they rolled their eyes, dismissing me as someone who didn't understand success. Her fiancé in particular had a way of smiling when I spoke, that patronizing grin that said, "You're just an old man, and I know better." They lived in a world built on appearances, on borrowed luxuries, funded by my sacrifices, yet they mocked the very simplicity that had allowed them those luxuries in the first place. Now, sitting in that hall after being humiliated in front of them all, I realized the truth. This wasn't new. The wedding prank was not an isolated cruelty. It was simply the culmination of years of hidden contempt that they no longer bothered to conceal. I had mistaken tolerance for respect, excuses for love, and their demands for signs that they still needed me. The truth was uglier. They never saw me as a father to be cherished. They saw me as a wallet, a crutch, a relic to ridicule behind closed doors. And now, they had shown their true colors in front of everyone. I sat through the rest of the wedding in silence, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my face a mask that betrayed nothing of the storm raging inside me. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed across the decorated hall, yet all of it felt distant, muffled, as if I were trapped behind glass. I watched my daughter twirl in her gown, her new husband's hand gripping hers as though he owned not just her, but the very air she breathed. Guests smiled and cheered, raising their glasses to celebrate what they thought was the start of a new life, but for me, it was the death of an illusion I had clung to for too long. Every smile directed at the couple reminded me of the countless times I had bent over backward to make sure she had something to smile about. Every word of praise for them sounded like a cruel reminder that my sacrifices were invisible, forgotten the moment they no longer served their needs. I sat there aching, not just from the fall, but from the bitter truth gnawing at me. They had never respected me, and perhaps they never would. I told myself to let it go, to not make a scene, to endure just as I always had, but something inside me resisted. The laughter that followed my fall, the way my daughter smiled nervously instead of defending me, and the smug grin on her husband's face as he held the room in his favor, these things were not just small slights. They were the final straw in a lifetime of small betrayals. In that chair, with music swelling around me and the taste of bitterness heavy on my tongue, something shifted deep within me. I had endured ridicule, I had swallowed disrespect, I had given and given until I had nothing left for myself, but now I saw the truth clearly. This wasn't just a joke. It wasn't harmless. It was a declaration, a deliberate act to show me my place, to strip me of dignity in front of everyone so I could never forget it. And I knew then that I could not remain silent forever. I stayed quiet that night, letting them bask in the glow of their celebration, but behind my still expression, I was making a promise to myself, a promise that this insult, this humiliation would not pass unnoticed. I had given my life for my daughter, but I would not give her and her husband the satisfaction of watching me crawl in the shadows of their mockery. Something hardened inside me at that wedding, something cold and resolute. They thought they had laughed at an old man and silenced him with shame, but what they had truly done was awaken a resolve that would not rest until they understood the cost of their cruelty. When I returned home that night, the silence greeted me like a heavy fog, wrapping itself around my chest and pressing in until I could hardly breathe. The house stood exactly as I had built it, brick by brick, plank by plank, every corner carrying the mark of my labor and sacrifice. I remembered the sweat dripping down my face the summer I laid the foundation, the winters when I worked with numb fingers to finish the roof, the evenings when I came home from double shifts just to sand down the floors so my family could have something smooth and safe to walk on. This house had been more than shelter. It had been proof of my devotion, a monument to the life I wanted to give them. But as I stepped through the door that night, it felt hollow, stripped of the warmth it once carried, as though the walls themselves knew the betrayal that had been shown to me. I set my jacket down on the chair by the door, the same chair I had repaired countless times, and the creak of the wood echoed through the empty rooms like a reminder of the years I had held everything together alone. The silence mocked me louder than the laughter had at the reception. I could still hear it, the sound of my daughter's nervous chuckle, the guests whispering, the cruel smirk of her new husband, and all of it followed me into this home I had given so much to build. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we had once shared meals, where I had helped her with schoolwork, where I had counted out bills and wondered how to stretch a single paycheck to cover everything she needed. My hands pressed flat against the wood, and I realized how cold it felt. Every memory of love and effort that had once filled this place seemed tainted now, because the very people I had built it for had stripped me of dignity in front of the world. The betrayal echoed louder here in solitude than it had in that crowded hall, because there was no distraction, no music, no clinking of glasses to drown it out. It was just me and the truth. I thought of her smile when I handed her the keys to her first apartment, the relief in her voice when I bailed her out of debt she had promised she would never fall into again, the countless reassurances I gave her that she could always count on me, and in return, she had let her husband reduce me to a joke, and she had laughed with him. I looked around the house, the home I had poured my very life into, and for the first time it felt like a cage. The silence pressed heavier and heavier until I understood that what I had built was not a family that cherished me, but a stage where I was expected to suffer quietly for their comfort. That night, sitting alone in the emptiness I had created, I knew the truth. If I continued to endure in silence, I would die not as a father remembered with love, but as a fool mocked even in absence. As I sat alone in that empty house, the memories came flooding back with a sharpness that cut deeper than any physical wound. I remembered the years when my body felt like it was breaking under the strain of 2 jobs, the long days in the factory, followed by nights driving delivery trucks, Also, my daughter would never have to worry about missing a class or going without books for school. I would come home with grease on my hands and blisters on my feet, and instead of collapsing into bed, I would sit at the table calculating bills, deciding which meals I could skip so she could eat properly and have money for her field trips or her uniforms. There were nights when my stomach growled so loud I feared she might hear it, but I smiled and told her I wasn't hungry because nothing mattered more than seeing her plate full. When she turned 16 and wanted her independence, I found an old car I could afford, one that barely ran, and I spent weeks in the garage after work repairing it piece by piece with my own hands. I scoured junkyards for affordable parts, knelt on the cold concrete floor for hours until my knees ached, and stained my clothes with oil I could never wash out. The day I handed her those keys, her eyes lit up, and she hugged me like I had given her the world. That moment alone had made every sacrifice feel worth it. But years later, I heard her fiancé laugh about that very car, calling it cheap and outdated, mocking me for not simply buying her something new, as if my sweat and effort meant nothing, as if the act of working with my hands was something to be sneered at instead of honored. He joked that it was a miracle the car had even run at all, dismissing my hard work as if it had been a waste, and she laughed with him. That was the moment I realized they would never understand the price I had paid for their comfort, because they had never known hunger, never known the exhaustion of working until your bones ached, never known the pride of fixing something with your own two hands. To them, it was just old-fashioned, embarrassing, beneath the shiny image they wanted to present to the world. As I sat there now, the silence of my house echoing around me, those memories felt poisoned. What I had once considered proof of my love had become, in their eyes, something laughable. And I could not shake the bitter truth that all those years of sacrifice, all those nights of hunger, all those hours in the garage had only taught them to look down on me rather than respect me. That realization dug deep into my chest, and I knew then that my sacrifices had built a life for them, but they had also built the weapon they now used to humiliate me. I sat at that table surrounded by silence and ghosts of my own sacrifices until the grief in my chest hardened into something sharper, something colder. At first, all I felt was the ache of humiliation, the sting of betrayal that left me hollow. But as the hours passed and the memories churned in my mind, I began to see things with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. I realized that for years I had been the backbone of their world, the invisible force that kept their image polished and their comforts intact. The down payment for their condo, the one they boasted about as if they had earned it themselves, had come directly from my savings. The business loans that her fiancé strutted around bragging about had been guaranteed with my name, my credit, my reputation, not his. The debts they had fallen into, the credit cards that threatened to drown them in interest, I had quietly paid off, telling myself it was only to give them a fair chance. Every cushion they leaned on, every safety net they fell into, it had always been me. Without me, without my years of sacrifice and my steady hand holding them up, their entire life would collapse in on itself like a poorly built house. They walked around proud and arrogant, mocking me for being simple, for being old-fashioned, for working with my hands instead of chasing easy wealth, but it was my sweat that paid for their luxuries. It was my name that shielded them from ruin, and in return, they gave me humiliation. They stripped me of dignity at my own daughter's wedding, laughing as if my worth were nothing. As that realization settled into me, the grief that had weighed me down shifted into resolve. I no longer felt like the victim they wanted me to believe I was. I saw now that I had been the quiet foundation they had mistaken for weakness, and I understood the power I still held. They thought they could laugh at me, dismiss me, humiliate me, but they did not see how fragile their world really was. Without me, without the steady stream of money and security I had always provided, they had nothing. Their lives, built on appearances and arrogance, would crumble the moment I withdrew. And, for the first time in years, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had been their safety net, but I did not have to be anymore. They had mistaken my patience for helplessness, my generosity for obligation. They had made me invisible in their eyes, but soon they would see me clearer than ever. That night, as I sat in the house I had built with my own hands, I made a silent vow. They would feel the loss of my support like a storm tearing through their perfect facade. They had broken me down for the last time. From here on, I would no longer be the man who endured in silence. I would be the man who made them understand what it meant to mock the very foundation of their lives. The next morning I woke with a stiffness in my back from the fall and an even deeper ache in my chest, but the haze of humiliation had burned away, leaving behind only clarity. I moved through the house, slowly, methodically, as though every step carried a purpose I had not felt in years. I pulled out an old wooden box from the closet, the one where I kept every important paper, every receipt, every contract. I set it down on the kitchen table, the same table where I had once sorted through bills, wondering how to keep the lights on, and I opened it with steady hands. One by one, I spread the records out before me. Bank statements, loan documents, mortgage agreements, trust accounts. Every scrap of paper that tied me to their comfort, every reminder of how much of myself I had poured into their lives, and I studied them not with the weary eyes of a father desperate to hold his family together, but with the cold calculation of a man finally ready to see the truth. The condo where they lived so proudly, flaunting the view and the expensive neighborhood to their friends, was under my name. I had provided the down payment, and without my backing the bank would have never approved their mortgage. The business loan her husband boasted about at every dinner party had my signature on the guarantee. The truth stared back at me from the ink. He would have never been able to start that business without me standing silently behind him. Even the car they drove, sleek and foreign, carried payments I had covered when they fell behind. And the debts, the endless debts, credit cards maxed out on vacations, restaurants, designer clothes, all paid down by me when the collectors began to circle. Every document screamed the same reality. Without me, their entire life collapsed. Without my steady hand, their comfort disappeared. Without my money, they had nothing but a hollow shell of pride. As I flipped through the papers, I noticed the patterns of entitlement woven into every page. They had never paused to thank me, never once stopped to ask how much it cost me to keep bailing them out. Instead, their demands had grown larger, their gratitude smaller, until it was nothing at all. They assumed my sacrifices were a given, that I would always be there to cover the cracks in the foundation of their reckless lives. Sitting there, surrounded by evidence, I saw how blind I had been. What I had once told myself was love, and duty had become servitude. I had given them not just support but control over my life, and they had used it to demean me. But now I had every record, every proof of their dependency laid out before me like pieces on a chessboard. And for the first time, I was ready to play, not as the fool they thought I was, but as the man who held every card. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, but this paper trail told another story. It told me exactly how fragile their empire was, and exactly how easily I could take it away. I knew I couldn't move forward blindly, so the next step was to find someone who could guide me with precision, someone who could take the storm of emotion raging in me and channel it into action. I pulled out a card I had kept tucked away for years, the contact of a lawyer who had once helped me settle a small property dispute. He was known for being sharp, meticulous, and, most importantly, loyal only to the truth written in contracts. When I called his office, my voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the fury that had driven me there. We set a meeting for the following day, and when I walked into his office with a folder stuffed full of documents, his eyes narrowed with curiosity. I laid everything on the table: bank statements, mortgage agreements, business loan guarantees, receipts of debts I had covered, and the details of assets still under my name. He listened carefully, interrupting only to ask pointed questions, his pen gliding across his notepad with the efficiency of a man already building a strategy in his mind. When I told him about the wedding, about the chair pulled out from under me, and the laughter that followed, he didn't laugh it off or try to comfort me with hollow words. He simply leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, "They've underestimated you. That can work in your favor." For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of validation. We went through each document one by one, and he explained the power I still held. The condo could be reclaimed, the mortgage transferred out of my name, and without me, the bank would have every right to repossess. The business loan, tied directly to my guarantee, could be revoked, leaving her husband to face the financial storm he had no means to weather. The accounts and assets I had built, currently structured in a way that left them room to exploit, could be restructured, redirected, sealed against their greedy hands. Every move was legal, every step precise, every action shielded by the law. I listened to him lay it out like a chess game, and with each plan, my grief hardened further into resolve. Together we mapped out a course of action that would leave no room for argument, no loophole to crawl through, no way for them to claim ignorance or innocence. When I left his office that day, the folder of documents felt lighter in my hands, but my heart felt heavier with determination. I had spent decades building, giving, sacrificing, only to be mocked and humiliated, but now I had a professional ally at my side, someone who would ensure that when the time came, my actions would not just be emotional, but final. They had thought I was an old man, weak and easy to exploit. What they did not know was that I had just armed myself with the one thing their arrogance could never defeat: strategy. I moved like a man with a plan, not like the hurt figure who had stumbled through his daughter's wedding, because grief had been replaced by a clear, cold map of every place they relied on me. I began with the simplest, most undeniable things: the papers that bore my name and my signature, the ones that showed exactly how their life had been propped up by my steadiness. First, I called the bank that held the mortgage on the condo they flaunted online, and I spoke in measured tones while the lawyer drafted the formal requests. No shouting, no threats, just the quiet voice of someone removing consent. We notified the lender that I would no longer be a guarantor and that any future dealings must be conducted between them and the account holders whose names were on the mortgage. It was surgical. The bank put a temporary hold on refinancing applications until they could reassess credit without my backing, and I listened to the silence on the other end of the line like a bell ringing in a church, resonant and final. Next came the business, the little empire of borrowed prestige my son-in-law had built on my name. He had boasted about his venture at dinners, used it as evidence of his cleverness and my supposed backwardness. The reality was ink on paper, My guarantee warmed the bank's ledger. My lawyer drafted revocation clauses and sent certified letters, removing my personal guarantee and invoking clauses I had the right to call upon. The business survived on more than bravado. It survived on my credit. With that guarantee withdrawn, the bank required immediate collateral or a restructuring plan from the owner. He had neither. I watched the way the couple's smiles tightened when a bank representative, with procedural politeness, asked for immediate documentation that simply did not exist. It was not cruelty to expose a lie. It was the law catching up with pretense. I closed accounts that were in my name, but which they treated as theirs. I canceled automatic transfers that I had set up during nights of worry and rushed calls, the little pensions and payments that had become their safety net. I shifted ownership of certain assets into an irrevocable trust I had long prepared with the lawyer, one structured so that it would provide for my needs and no longer be an open door for their reckless spending. That trust directed distributions to me and to a charity in my mother's name, not to any beneficiary the couple could claim. The trust documents were precise and ironclad because I had learned over the years that vague promises were the enemy of justice. I also moved to reclaim items that had been placed under my name but used as theirs. The car that bore my payments when they defaulted on their own, the accounts I had opened to help them build credit, the emergency lines I had authorized when their cards were maxed out, all were reviewed and recalibrated. Where legally permissible, I reclaimed title. Where joint ownership prevented immediate seizure, I made the partners aware of my intent and set deadlines that I intended them to miss. Each action was accompanied by a certified letter, a bank ledger entry, a phone call recorded and archived. I did not want to be petty. I wanted clarity, and clarity required paper and witness and procedure. People often think revenge is fireworks and spectacle. It is not. It is the quiet closure of the ledger, the removal of permissions, the slow turning off of conveniences that have been assumed for too long. I watched the ripples begin. Friends who had accepted brunch invitations from them suddenly called to ask about the condo's mortgage. Suppliers began sending polite reminders to the business email now flagged by the bank. The couple texted me with thinly veiled threats and pleas, but I had already rehearsed my answers with my lawyer. No more loans, no more guarantees, no beneficiaries where I had not explicitly approved them. No trust funds without oversight that secured the future of potential grandchildren in a way that honored the life I had built, not the lifestyle they had borrowed from me. With each step, I felt less like the man who had fallen to the floor and more like the architect of consequences. The silence after their panic was its own kind of justice, but the real peace came from knowing I had taken back control of what was rightly mine and protected what I still wanted to keep. While I worked quietly and methodically with my lawyer to untangle every thread that tied me to their comforts, my daughter and her new husband moved through the world as if nothing had changed. In fact, they did more than ignore the truth. They flaunted their arrogance. I heard from distant relatives that the couple was boasting to friends about how they were finally free of my shadow, how they no longer needed me to carry them, how they were stepping into a future built on their own success. They painted me as a tired old man, the kind who clings to the past and doesn't understand the modern world. They laughed about my fall at the wedding, repeating it as though it were a party anecdote instead of the moment that split my heart in two. He couldn't even sit down without making a scene, her husband joked to one of his business acquaintances, and my daughter laughed along with him, her voice light and careless, as though the memory of her father sprawled on the ground was nothing more than comic relief. They thought that by mocking me, they elevated themselves, that by reducing me to a relic, they could cement their own image as forward-thinking and untouchable. They told anyone who would listen that their new life was completely their own doing, that they had broken free from the constraints of an old man who never understood ambition. I listened to these accounts with a stillness that surprised even me, because where once I would have burned with hurt, I now recognized their words for what they truly were: arrogance born of ignorance. They had no idea how much of their foundation had already begun to crumble beneath them, no idea that the security they flaunted was a mirage already evaporating. They mocked me for being outdated, for living simply, for building things with my hands instead of borrowing and bluffing my way through life. But it was that very simplicity and patience that had allowed me to take action while they bragged. Every time they laughed about the wedding, every time they spun the story of my fall into evidence of weakness, they revealed more about themselves than they did about me. They showed their friends and colleagues the depth of their cruelty, their willingness to humiliate family for entertainment, their eagerness to trample respect for the sake of a story. And while their circle clapped and chuckled, I knew those same people would not stand beside them when the banks called, when the repossessions began, when the facade of success cracked wide open. Their arrogance blinded them, and in that blindness they mocked the very man who had been holding their world together. They thought I had become irrelevant, a shadow fading from their lives. But in truth, I had become the storm they never saw coming. One evening, not long after the wedding, I stopped by their condo unannounced, carrying with me a stack of documents they had left unsigned from a minor matter I was still cleaning up. I knocked, but no one came to the door, and when I found it ajar, I stepped in, calling my daughter's name. There was no answer, but voices drifted from the other room, low at first, then sharp and clear when they began to laugh. I froze in place, the papers in my hand trembling as I caught the words that spilled out of their conversation. My son-in-law was saying, "Once he's gone, this whole house of his is wasted space. We should sell it off quickly before it falls apart. Think of the money we could get for it, finally something useful from that old place." My daughter's laughter followed, light and cruel, and then she added, "Honestly, it's just a burden now. He doesn't need all that space. We should have pushed him to downsize years ago. Maybe a facility would be better for him soon, somewhere with nurses to keep him from tripping over his own feet." They both laughed again, louder this time, the kind of laughter that carries no hesitation, no shame. I stood there, gripping those papers so hard the edges cut into my skin, my heart pounding not from surprise, but from confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect. They weren't just ungrateful. They weren't just arrogant. They were planning for my death, already dividing what they thought would soon be theirs, already mocking the idea of putting me away in a care home like some forgotten burden. My own daughter, whose cradle I had rocked, whose tears I had dried, whose every dream I had financed, was speaking of me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle in her path to more money, more comfort, more status. I backed away silently, unwilling to let them know I had heard, the sound of their laughter chasing me down the hall and out into the night air. The house I had built with my own 2 hands suddenly felt different in my mind, no longer the symbol of sacrifice and devotion, but now a prize they were waiting to strip from me the moment I could no longer defend it. Their words cut deeper than any mockery at the wedding ever could, because this was not a prank or a careless laugh. This was cruelty born of calculation. They saw my years of labor, the sweat that stained those walls and floors, not as love but as real estate to be cashed in. As I walked away into the cool night, I felt something harden inside me to steel. They had revealed themselves fully, and I knew then that my resolve was no longer about reclaiming dignity alone. It was about protection, about making sure that everything I had built, everything I had given, would never fall into the greedy hands of those who had already written me off as dead. I carried the weight of those words with me like a stone lodged in my chest, the sound of my daughter's laughter as she spoke about selling my house and locking me in a facility, replaying over and over in my head until it became unbearable. To hear it from her, the child I had raised with every ounce of strength in my body, the child whose happiness had been the reason I worked myself into exhaustion year after year, it pierced me in a way nothing else ever had. I had endured humiliation before, endured arrogance and dismissal, but this was different. This was my own flesh and blood wishing me gone, erasing me from the picture of her future as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience to be handled and discarded. For a moment I let myself feel it fully, the sting of betrayal so sharp it made my eyes burn, the ache of knowing that the love I had given without condition had not just been ignored but had soured into contempt. It would have been easy to let that pain destroy me, to let it turn into despair that kept me sitting alone in my hollow house until the day they got what they wanted. But instead, that pain transformed inside me, hardening into something colder and sharper. It became fuel. Every laugh, every dismissive glance, every cruel word they had spoken about me became kindling for a fire I could no longer ignore. If my daughter saw me as a burden, then I would show her what life looked like without my sacrifices propping it up. If her husband thought my house was nothing more than real estate waiting to be cashed in, then I would make certain he never so much as touched a single brick of it. They had shown me exactly what they were, and in doing so, they had given me permission to act without hesitation. I no longer wrestled with guilt, no longer tried to justify their behavior as thoughtlessness or immaturity. Their laughter had stripped away the last of my illusions and left only truth, and the truth demanded action. I sat in the quiet of my home, staring at the walls I had built with my hands, and instead of feeling sorrow, I began to feel something close to anticipation. Every nail, every beam, every drop of sweat that had gone into this place would not become their inheritance. It would become their loss. I realized then that revenge was not an act of cruelty on my part, but an act of justice. It was the only language they would understand, the only way to make them see the cost of their arrogance. My pain had transformed into a weapon, and I would wield it with precision. They thought they had laughed me into silence, but what they had really done was forge the steel of my resolve. Once the decision hardened inside me, the rest unfolded like clockwork. I met with my lawyer regularly, never missing an appointment, each session a careful dissection of my life's work and how to ensure it would never fall into the hands of those who had already counted me out. We worked in silence most of the time, the scratching of his pen and the clicking of his computer keys punctuating the still air of his office. He walked me through every step with a precision that gave me a strange kind of peace. One by one, the properties I had foolishly tethered to their names were redirected, transferred, or shielded. The condo that had become their trophy, the one they flaunted to friends as evidence of their independence, was quietly shifted into a trust where they had no claim. Ownership papers were filed, notarized, and archived, every line of ink forming a barrier they would never be able to cross. The business loan guarantees were revoked, severing the lifeline that had allowed my son-in-law to parade around as a self-made man, when in truth he had been standing on my shoulders the entire time. Financial accounts were combed through meticulously, each automatic transfer scrutinized and canceled, each joint account restructured so that every cent flowed back into my control. Where once my money had been siphoned away without thought, it now circled back like a tide reclaiming what had been stolen. Then came the will, the document they no doubt assumed would one day deliver to them everything I had built. I sat across from my lawyer as he read aloud the revisions, and for the first time in years I felt as though I could breathe. My daughter and her husband were cut out entirely. No inheritance, no property, no claim to the home they had mocked, no access to the accounts they had drained. Instead, my estate was restructured to ensure it would provide for causes that mattered to me, for charities and institutions that honored work and sacrifice rather than entitlement. The rest would be secured in ways that would benefit those who truly respected me, people who had shown gratitude instead of greed. Every change was done quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or warning. To the outside world, nothing seemed different. My daughter and her husband went on boasting, still laughing about their independence, still mocking the man they believed too weak to defend himself. They had no idea that with each smug word, their safety net was being unraveled thread by thread, and by the time they realized, it would already be too late. That thought brought me a grim kind of satisfaction, not the giddy triumph of petty revenge, but the solemn relief of a man finally reclaiming what was his. The law was no longer just ink on paper, it was my shield, my sword, and my voice. And through it, I was ensuring that the legacy of my life's work would be remembered not as the spoils of ingrates, but as the vindication of a man who refused to die mocked and forgotten. I agreed to attend the family dinner not out of longing for their company, but because I wanted to see them in their element, to witness firsthand the arrogance they wore like a second skin. The restaurant was expensive, the kind where the lighting was dim and the plates were more art than food, and they had chosen it deliberately to showcase the image they worked so hard to maintain. My daughter greeted me with a practiced smile, her hand resting possessively on her husband's arm as if she were showing off a prized possession. He shook my hand with that same condescending grip he had used since the first day I met him, leaning in to tell me about his business ventures as though I had never heard of them before. They spoke loudly enough for the whole table to hear, bragging about deals and investments, sprinkling in names of people they barely knew but wanted to impress. My daughter chimed in about their condo, about the trips they were planning, about the future they were building on their own. Every word was a lie, every boast a performance propped up by money and security they no longer realized had been pulled out from under them. I sat there quietly, cutting into my meal with steady hands, nodding when appropriate, offering nothing more than the occasional polite smile. Outwardly I appeared calm, a tired old man content to let the younger generation take the spotlight, but inside me the storm raged. Every memory of sacrifice, every insult, every overheard cruelty replayed behind my still eyes. Their laughter, their smugness, their belief that they had outgrown me, it all fanned the flames of the resolve I kept hidden. I watched as they ordered bottle after bottle of overpriced wine, as they leaned back in their seats with careless confidence, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath them had already begun to crack. I caught glimpses of pity from other relatives around the table, the kind of pity reserved for someone they thought was too old, too outdated to keep up with the pace of the younger ones. Let them think that. let them believe I was fading quietly into the background. It only made the silence more powerful. I sat through their boasting as though it were a play being performed for my benefit, and though they did not know it, I was already holding the script for the final act. I had no need to argue, no desire to remind them of the truths they denied. My calmness was my mask, my composure, my weapon. Every minute I stayed silent was another step closer to the reckoning they never saw coming. By the time dessert was served, I had given them nothing to suspect, nothing to prepare for. They walked out of that dinner thinking they had paraded their success before me, that they had proven once again how small and outdated I was. But as I watched them leave, arm in arm, smug smiles plastered across their faces, I knew with absolute certainty that the next time we sat together would not end with laughter. It would end with truth. I chose my moment carefully, waiting until enough time had passed after the wedding and their boasting dinners that suspicion no longer lingered in their minds. Then I sent out the invitations, handwritten notes and polite phone calls, asking my daughter, her husband, and the rest of the close family to join me at the house for an evening of future planning. I used those exact words because I knew how they would hear them. To my daughter and her husband, it would sound like inheritance, like assets finally being passed into their hands, the payday they had been waiting for. To the others, it would carry a sense of duty, a father preparing his affairs, a gathering to ensure no loose ends were left unattended. Every person I wanted there accepted, the curiosity in their voices betraying eagerness they thought I could not detect. I cleaned the house in the days leading up to it, not because I cared about their judgment, but because I wanted everything in its place, a stage set with the same precision I had built my plan. The photographs on the walls, the furniture I had repaired countless times, the smell of polish on the wooden floors, each detail was deliberate, a reminder that this house was my creation, my legacy, not theirs. When the evening arrived, they came dressed as though for a celebration. My daughter wore a new dress, her husband a suit a little too tight around the shoulders, and both walked in with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Behind them came the relatives, cousins and siblings, aunts and uncles, people who had witnessed my years of sacrifice, but never the quiet erosion of respect I endured. They filled the living room with chatter, glasses of wine clinking, the air thick with expectation. My daughter leaned in to whisper to her husband, her voice not low enough to escape me. "I told you he'd finally get around to it," he smirked, brushing a hand over his tie, already imagining what he thought was coming. I said little at first, allowing them to grow comfortable, to believe their assumptions. I poured drinks, set out small plates of food, and let the room hum with anticipation. Only when I saw the eagerness fully settle in their eyes did I take my place at the head of the table. My hands rested flat on the polished wood, steady and calm, my face unreadable. I looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw their attention fully onto me. They thought I had gathered them to hand over the fruits of my labor, to admit my time was nearly done. What they did not know was that the documents waiting in the drawer beside me were not gifts, but revelations, not blessings, but consequences. I had invited them here under the guise of planning for the future, and that was true. But the future I had in mind was nothing like the one they had imagined. The moment arrived when the chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to me with the expectation that I would finally surrender what they believed was theirs by right. I remained seated at the head of the table, the documents neatly stacked in front of me, my hands folded calmly over them. I began with a steady voice, not raised but carrying enough weight that no one dared interrupt. I asked you all here tonight because it's time to make my future, and yours, clear. My daughter straightened in her chair. Her husband leaned back with the smug confidence of a man already counting money in his head, and the relatives looked on with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. I slid the first set of papers across the table. As of last month, I revoked my guarantee on your business loans. I looked directly at my son-in-law, whose smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the notarized documents. The bank now requires collateral from you alone. They will not be calling me anymore. A murmur rippled through the room as I laid down the next folder. The condo you both live in, the one you've paraded around as your achievement, was purchased under my name. I have transferred ownership into a trust you are not part of. You will vacate when the bank finishes the reassessment. That home will not be yours to sell, not now, not ever. My daughter's face flushed, her lips parted in disbelief as she reached for the papers, flipping through them with shaking hands. Her husband barked out something about legality, but the signatures, the stamps, the seals stared back at him in undeniable truth. Then I took out the will, the one they had both been waiting for, the one they had been whispering about behind my back. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and read aloud the revisions. My estate, my house, my accounts, all of it has been redirected. None of it will go to you. You have been removed as beneficiaries. I paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. Everything I worked for, everything I bled for, will not be squandered by arrogance and ingratitude. It will go to causes and people who understand what sacrifice means. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sharp intake of my daughter's breath. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of loss, of entitlement slipping from her grasp. Her husband's face turned red, fury etched into every line as he sputtered threats that carried no weight against the documents I had already filed and secured. Then, for the first time, I spoke not of paperwork, but of the truth they had tried to bury. I told the room about the chair pulled out from under me at the wedding, about the laughter that followed, about the way my daughter had stood there and done nothing. I told them of the conversations I had overheard, how they spoke of selling my house when I was gone, how they joked about putting me in a facility like I was a burden. Gasps rose from the relatives, their eyes wide with horror, some turning on my daughter and her husband with disbelief, others shaking their heads in disgust. I let the weight of their own words crush them, the proof of their dependency laid bare for all to see. They had mocked me as an old man too weak to stand, but here, in front of everyone, I stood taller than ever. I did not raise my voice, I did not lash out, I simply presented the truth, and the truth was enough to strip them of their pride, their image, and their illusions of power. By the time I pushed the final stack of papers across the table, their faces were pale, their hands trembling, their arrogance shattered. They had believed me irrelevant, but now they saw me for what I was, the architect of their downfall, the man who held the foundation they had built their false lives upon, and the one who had finally taken it away. The silence after my words stretched so long it felt like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on everyone in the room. My daughter sat frozen, her hands clutching the papers as though holding them tighter might change the ink written on the pages. Her husband's face, once so smug, drained of color, leaving behind the ashen pallor of a man who finally understood the ground beneath him, had vanished. They looked to each other, searching for reassurance, but found only fear mirrored back. The arrogance that had carried them into this room was gone, stripped away by the weight of undeniable truth. My daughter tried to speak, her voice trembling, but the words faltered before leaving her lips. Her husband barked out half-formed protests about legality, about family, about betrayal, but no one at that table believed him anymore. The relatives who had once laughed quietly at my fall during the wedding, the ones who had whispered about me being too old to matter, now sat in stunned silence, their gazes fixed not on me but on the guilty pair. I saw it in their eyes, respect, sharp and sudden, replacing pity. They realized the man they had dismissed had not been weak at all, but had been carrying more strength than they had ever recognized. The ones who had smirked when I was humiliated now looked ashamed of themselves, unable to meet my gaze, and in that silence, the shame that should have been mine was returned to its rightful owners. My daughter's lips quivered as she tried again, this time whispering, "Dad, please." "We didn't mean," but I raised my hand, steady and calm, and the words died in her throat. Her husband shifted in his chair, sweat gathering at his temples, his bravado collapsing with every second that passed. He looked small now, not the towering figure of arrogance he had pretended to be, but a child stripped of his toys, scrambling to hold on to an image that no longer existed. The relatives began to murmur, their voices low but sharp, judgment dripping from every whispered word. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others muttered about disgrace, and the weight of those murmurs bore down on my daughter and her husband more heavily than my documents ever could. They had been exposed, their cruelty revealed, their dependency laid bare for all to see. And while they sat there trembling, pale and broken, I remained still, my back straight, my hands folded neatly in front of me. I did not gloat. I did not need to. Their humiliation was complete, their collapse inevitable. The same guests who had once looked at me as an old man to be mocked now met my eyes with something different: respect, recognition, even a hint of admiration. They had seen me fall, and now they saw me rise, not by shouting or force, but by truth and resolve. My daughter and her husband had thought themselves untouchable, but in the end, they were the ones stripped bare, left with nothing but shame in front of the very family they had sought to impress. The respect I had lost in that wedding hall returned to me tenfold that night, while they, the architects of my humiliation, were left to sit in the ruins of their arrogance. When the last of the documents had been read, and the murmurs of the family had swelled into judgment against the very people who had once mocked me, I felt no triumph, no need to shout or revel in their collapse. Instead, I felt a calmness settle over me, the kind of deep quiet that comes after a storm has spent its rage. My daughter sat hunched over, her hands trembling, as she clutched papers that had erased the future she thought was promised to her, while her husband stared blankly, his pride crushed into dust before the eyes of those he had once tried so hard to impress. I rose from my chair slowly, my back straight, my movements deliberate, and for the first time since that humiliating night at the wedding, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. There was no need to say more. The truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. As I walked toward the door, the relatives who had once snickered at my fall now watched me with respect in their eyes, some even nodding slightly as if to acknowledge that they finally understood who I truly was. Their gazes followed me, not with pity, but with recognition. I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had not sunk to the level of cruelty my daughter and her husband had shown me. I had stood firm, revealed the truth, and taken back everything they had stolen from me with their entitlement. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp against my face, and I breathed it in like it was the first real breath I had taken in years. For so long I had carried the burden of their ingratitude, the weight of sacrifices dismissed and mocked, but now it was gone. I no longer owed them anything. I no longer had to fear what they would take from me next. My dignity was no longer theirs to toy with. My legacy was secured, locked away from greedy hands, preserved on my terms, not theirs. I walked home slowly, not as the man who had once been humiliated in front of a hall full of guests, but as a man vindicated, a man who had faced betrayal and chosen not to bow, but to rise. The house I had built with my own hands waited for me, no longer a symbol of what they planned to steal, but a fortress of what I had reclaimed. And as I crossed its threshold, I felt peace in knowing that my life's work would endure, that my story would not end with laughter at my expense, but with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be forgotten as a fool. They had mocked me as old and weak, but in the end, I left them with nothing but shame, while I carried with me the one thing they could never touch, my dignity intact and unbroken.